The dust rose in columns across the flatlands, and Kalen Thorne watched from his porch as riders approached. Not just any riders. The great Chief Manga sat tall on a dark horse, wearing full ceremonial regalia, eagle feathers. Catching the morning light, beaded chest piece glinting, ceremonial lance held upright. Behind him, 6 warriors. Fanned out in formation, they stopped 30 paces from the house, the chief's eyes locked onto Kalen's. Neither man moved. The silence stretched until it felt like the air itself might crack. Kalen's hand hung near his belt, but he wore no weapon. He'd been cleaning fence posts. When he heard the hoof beats, everything in him screamed that this moment would change his life forever. He just didn't know if he'd survive it. 24 hours earlier, Ken had been checking the water line that fed his property from the creek 2 miles east. The fence posts needed replacing before winter, and he'd been making mental notes about which sections couldn't wait another season. That's when he saw the body. At first, he thought it was an animal, something dark against the pale dirt near the water's edge. But as he got closer, the shape resolved into a person, a young man lying face down, one arm stretched toward the creek like he'd been crawling. Blood darkened the sand beneath him. Callan dismounted slowly. His horse stamped nervously. The man wore torn buckskin pants and a simple shirt that had once been tan, but was now stained rust red across the back. Long black hair fanned across his shoulders. Apache Ken stood there. Longer than he wanted to admit. Out here, decisions like this one could end you. Helping the wrong person, being seen with the wrong person. It didn't matter what your intentions were. Someone always interpreted it as taking a side, and once you took a side in this territory, the other side remembered. But the young man's fingers twitched, still alive, barely. Callan crouched down and pressed 2 fingers against the man's neck, pulse weak and irregular. He rolled him over carefully. The Apache's face was young, maybe mid-20s, with a deep gash across his temple and what looked like a puncture wound in his side. His eyes fluttered open for just a second, dark brown, unfocused, filled with pain and something else, fear. Then they closed again. Callan looked around the empty landscape. No one for miles. No witnesses. No one to know what happened next except him and this dying stranger. He could leave, ride back to the house, pretend he'd never seen anything. The man would be dead by sundown, and the desert would erase all evidence. Instead, Callan slid his arms under the Apache's shoulders and knees and lifted. The man was lighter than he expected, all lean muscle and sharp bones. His head lolled against Callan's chest. Blood seeped warm through Callan's shirt. He secured the unconscious man across his saddle and led the horse back toward his property on foot. Every step felt heavier than the last, not from the weight, from the knowing whatever happened after this, there'd be no going back to the quiet anonymity he'd built for himself out here. By the time he got the Apache inside and onto the narrow bed in the back room, the sun had dropped low. Ken lit 2 lanterns and set to work. He'd patched up injured animals plenty of times, and men weren't all that different when it came down to it. Clean the wound, stop the bleeding, keep infection out. The gash on the head looked worse than it was the side wound, though. That was deep, something sharp driven in and twisted. Callan washed it out with whiskey, packed it with clean cloth, and wrapped the man's torso tight enough to hold pressure without crushing his ribs. The Apache stirred once, mumbling something in a language Ken didn't understand, but never fully woke. Ken sat in the chair by the door and watched him through the night. The man's breathing stayed shallow but steady in the lantern light. Ken could see he was younger than he'd first thought. Just a kid, really. What had he been doing out there alone? Where had he come from? Who had done this to him? Questions Callan would probably never get answers to when dawn broke and pale light filtered through the single window. Callan stood to stretch his back. He walked to the front room to make coffee. When he returned 5 minutes later, the bed was empty. The back door stood open. Boot prints led away into the scrub brush. The Apache was gone. Callan stood in the doorway of the empty room and stared at the rumpled blanket. The blood-stained cloth he'd used to pack the wound lay discarded on the floor. Outside, The tracks led east toward the ridge line, uneven and dragging in places. The man had barely been able to stand when Kalen brought him in. Now he'd walked away on his own. Stupid. That's what it was. The Apache would collapse again before he made a mile. The wound would reopen, he'd bleed. Out somewhere in the scrub where no one would find him until the buzzards did their work. Callan walked out to the corral and checked his horses. Both animals stood calm, ears forward, undisturbed. If the Apache had tried to take one, they would have raised noise, so he'd left on foot, injured, without supplies or water. That told Kalen something important. The man had been desperate to get away, not just from the house, from him. He spent the morning replacing fence posts along the western edge of his property. Physical work helped him think, or maybe it helped him not think. Either way, his hands stayed busy while his mind turned over the same questions. Had he made a mistake? Would someone come looking for the Apache? Would they assume Kalen had something to do with the attack? Out here, assumptions got people buried. By noon, the sun beat down white and merciless. Kalen wiped sweat from his face and looked toward the eastern hills. Nothing moved out there except heat shimmer. If the Apache had made it back to wherever he'd come from, there'd be no sign. If he'd collapsed, Ken wouldn't know until he rode out to check. And riding out to check meant following the trail, which meant being seen following the trail. If anyone else was watching, he decided against it. Whatever happened next was out of his hands now. That night, Kalen sat on his porch with a tin cup of coffee and watched the stars emerge. The air cooled fast once the sun dropped, and he pulled his jacket tighter. Somewhere out in that darkness, the Apache was either dead, dying, or explaining to someone why a settler had pulled him out of the dirt and patched him up. Ken wondered which scenario worried him more. Sleep came in fragments. He kept waking to sounds that weren't there: hoof beats, voices, the creak of footsteps on wood. Each time he'd sit up, listen hard, hear nothing but wind and his own breathing. By the time dawn broke, he felt more exhausted than when he'd lain down. He made coffee and stood at the window, watching the light spread across the land. Everything looked the same as it always did, empty, quiet, his for as long as he could hold it. Then he heard them faint at first. A rhythmic sound carried on the still morning air. Kalen set down his cup and walked outside. The sound grew louder. Not one horse, several coming fast. He stepped off the porch and shaded his eyes against the rising sun. Dust rose in the distance, and shapes emerged from it. Riders moving in formation, heading straight for his property. Kalen's chest tightened. He thought about going inside for his rifle, but they were already too close. Running would be pointless. Whatever was coming, he'd have to face it. Standing exactly where he was, the riders slowed as they approached. 7 of them. The lead horse was dark as burned wood, and the man on its back wore a headdress of eagle feathers that caught the light like a crown. His face was weathered and severe, marked by old scars. He wore a bone breastplate over buckskin and beaded patterns decorated his sleeves. In his right hand, he carried a lance adorned with red feathers. The great chief Mongas behind him. 6 warriors spread out in a careful line, each one armed, each one watching Callan with expressions that gave nothing away. They stopped 30 paces from the house. The chief dismounted, slowly, deliberately, and stood with his lance planted in the ground beside him. Kalen forced himself to stay still, his pulse hammered in his ears. The chief looked at him for a long moment, then spoke in clear, measured English. "You're Kalen Thorne?" It wasn't a question. Call nodded once. His mouth had gone dry. "I am." The chief's eyes moved past him to the house, then back to his face. 2 days ago, my son rode east to scout the canyon trails. He did not return. Yesterday before dawn, he walked into our camp, wounded, weak, but alive. The chief paused. He told me what happened. Kalen's mind raced. Son, the Apache he pulled from the creek wasn't just any warrior. He was the chief's son. That changed everything, or maybe it changed nothing. He still didn't know if he was about to die. He said, "You found him dying." Mongas continued. His voice carried across the space between them. steady and deliberate. You brought him to your home. You cleaned his wounds. You gave him shelter through the night. I did, Kalen said. His voice came out rougher than he intended. Why? The question hung in the air. Kalen could feel the other warriors watching him, measuring him. One wrong word, and this conversation would end very differently because he needed help, Kalen said. Finally, that's all. Manga studied him in silence. The morning sun climbed higher and shadows shortened across the dirt. A hawk cried somewhere overhead. Finally, the chief spoke again. My son is called in the hall. He is my eldest. When he did not return, we prepared to honor his death. His mother cut her hair. His brother painted his face for mourning. We believe him taken by enemies or the desert. The chief's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. You return him to us. Kalen didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. Manga stepped forward, closing half the distance between them. Kalen's instinct screamed at him to step back, but he held his ground. The chief stopped and drove his lance into the earth with a solid thud. Among my people, a life dead is sacred. You saved my son. That makes you untouchable by Apache hands. No warrior of mine will raise a weapon against you. No raid will touch your property. You have my protection for as long as I draw breath. The words should have brought relief. Instead, Kalen felt his stomach drop. Protection from the Apache meant being marked in the eyes of every settler within a 100 miles. It meant suspicion, accusations, being labeled a sympathizer or worse. It meant becoming a target for people who already saw this land as us versus them. I appreciate that, Kalen said carefully, but I didn't help him for protection. I'd have done the same for anyone. I know, Manga said. That is why I came myself to see the man who does not calculate his mercy. One of the warriors behind Manga's shifted in his saddle. Kalen caught the movement from the corner of his eye, a subtle sign of impatience or disagreement. Not everyone in the chief's party approved of this visit. That much was clear. Manga seemed to notice it too. He turned slightly and spoke a few words in Apache. The warrior straightened but didn't respond. Tension rippled through the group like wind through tall grass. The chief turned back to Kalen. Some of my men believe any settler is an enemy. They do not understand why honor a debt to someone who looks like those who have taken our land. He let that settle before continuing. And your people will not understand why I stand here speaking to you with respect instead of anger. We both know this. Kalen met his eyes. Yes. So we have a problem. Manga said, you saved my son, and now you are caught between two worlds. Neither will forgive you easily. He pulled his lance from the ground and rested it across his shoulder. But a debt is a debt, and I always pay what I owe. He turned and walked back to his horse. The other warriors began to wheel their mounts around. Kalen thought the conversation was over. Then Mongus paused with one foot in the stirrup and looked back. 3 nights from now, there will be a gathering at the old stone formation east of the canyon. My people will hear what happened and see that the dead is recognized. His eyes locked onto Kalen's. You will come not as a guest, not as an outsider, as someone owed. Before Kalen could respond, Manga sung onto his horse and signaled his warriors forward. They rode out the same way they'd come, dust rising behind them, until the desert swallowed them whole. Kalen stood alone in his yard, heart pounding, staring at the place where they'd been 3 nights, a gathering he'd just been invited into the heart of. Apache territory where settlers didn't go and didn't return from, and refusing wasn't an option. For the rest of that day, Ken couldn't focus on anything. He tried to work, checking fence lines, repairing a broken hinge on the barn door, organizing supplies in the shed. But his hands moved without his mind following. All he could think about was the gathering, 3 nights, an Apache ceremony in territory no settler had seen and lived to describe. He knew what it meant. Mongus was publicly declaring the debt, making it known among his people that Ken Thorne had saved the chief's son and earned protection. It was an honor. It was also a death sentence if anyone else found out. The nearest settlement was 15 miles south. Small place, maybe 20 families, a trading post. and a stable Kalen went. There twice a month for supplies, and kept his interactions brief. People knew him as the man who lived alone past the Eastern Ridge, quiet, kept to himself, minded his own business. That reputation had served him well, but reputations were fragile things. One rumor about meeting with Mongus, and everything would change. He'd be labeled a traitor, his property would become a target. Settlers didn't forgive collaboration, real or perceived. They'd run him out or burn him out, and neither option ended. Well, still, refusing Mongus wasn't possible either. The chief had spoken in front of his warriors. The invitation had been given formally with witnesses. Declining it would be an insult, and insulting the man who just offered protection meant losing that protection. It meant making an enemy of the most powerful Apache leader in the territory. Kalen was trapped between two sides of a conflict he'd never wanted to join. That evening, he sat on his porch and watched the sun drop below the western hills. The sky turned orange, then purple, then deep blue scattered with stars. Somewhere out in that darkness, Nolly was recovering from wounds that should have ended him. And somewhere out there, Mongus was preparing to honor a debt that might end Kalen instead. The second day passed slower than the first. Kalen rode out to check on his water source and found fresh tracks near the creek. Unshaw horses, 3, maybe 4, they'd come through during the night and moved east toward the canyon. Apache scouts most likely watching, making sure he was alone, making sure no one else was coming. He wondered if they were protecting him or just keeping an eye on a potential threat. On the third day, Ken cleaned his rifle and checked his ammunition, not because he planned to use it. Bringing a weapon to the gathering would be suicide, but because routines steadied his nerves. He also packed a small leather bag with dried meat, a canteen of water, and a wool blanket. If things went badly, he might not make it back before dark. As the sun began its descent, he saddled his horse and rode east. The stone formation Mongus had mentioned was 2 hours away, tucked between canyon walls where the land folded in on itself. Kalen had seen it from a distance once, but never approached. It was Apache land, always had been. The ride felt longer than it should have. Every shadow looked like movement. Every sound made him tense. By the time he reached the mouth of the canyon, twilight had settled over everything, turning the world gray and uncertain. He followed the narrow path between rock walls until it opened into a wide clearing, and there, beneath the ancient stone formation that rose like a sentinel against the darkening sky, fires burned in careful rows, dozens of them. And around those fires sat more Apache than Kalen had ever seen in one place. Men, women, children, elders with lined faces, warriors with weapons laid across their laps. All of them turned to look at him as he emerged from the canyon path. The silence was absolute. Kalen's horse stopped on its own. Sensing the tension, he could feel eyes on him from every direction, curious, hostile, calculating. He scanned the crowd and found Manga standing near the largest fire, his headdress unmistakable. Even in the dim light, beside him stood a younger man with bandages visible beneath his shirt. Nahal, the son he'd saved. The reason he was here, the reason he might not leave. Mongus raised one hand, and the silence deepened. Then he spoke, his voice carrying across the clearing in Apache. Kalen didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone, formal, declarative, important. When the chief finished speaking, he switched to English and looked directly at Kalen. Come forward. Calenthorn, let my people see the man who returned my son from death. Kalen dismounted slowly. His legs felt unsteady as he walked his horse forward through the crowd. People parted to let him pass, but their faces showed everything from curiosity to outright anger. A child whispered something and was quickly hushed by her mother. An older warrior spat into the dirt as Kalen passed. Another simply stared, hand resting on the knife at his belt. When Kalen reached the central fire, Mongus gestured for him to stop. Nolly stood beside his father, and Kalen got his first clear look at the young man he'd pulled from the creek. Nahal's face was lean and strong with dark eyes that held a mixture of discomfort and something that might have been gratitude. The bandages around his torso were clean and tight. He'd been well cared for since returning home. My people need to see this, Mongus said to Kalen. They need to understand that honor exists even between enemies. He turned to address the crowd, speaking in Apache again. His tone shifted, less formal now, more explanatory. Some people nodded. Others crossed their arms and looked away. When Mongus finished, an older warrior stepped forward from the crowd. His face was deeply lined, his hair streaked with gray. He wore no headdress, but his bearing suggested authority. He spoke rapidly in Apache, his voice sharp and challenging. Kalen didn't need translation to understand the anger behind the words. Mongus listened without interrupting. When the older warrior finished, the chief responded in measured tones. The exchange went back and forth 3 times before the older warrior made a disgusted sound and stepped back into the crowd. But he didn't sit down. He remained standing, arms crossed, glaring at Kalen with undisguised hostility. That is Delgato, Mongus said quietly to Kalen, my second war chief. He believes this gathering is a mistake. He says, showing gratitude to a settler weakens us, makes us look soft. The chief's expression remained neutral. He is not alone in thinking this. Kalen glanced around the gathering. At least a dozen warriors wore the same skeptical expression as Delgado. They were outnumbered by those who seemed willing to accept their chief's decision. But the division was clear. This wasn't a united celebration of honor. It was a fracture barely held together by respect for Mongus. Nahal stepped forward, moved stiffly, favoring his left side where the wound was deepest. When he spoke, his English was accented, but clear. I would be dead without this man. I know this. 3 settlers ambushed me. While I scouted the southern ridge, they left me for dead in the dirt. He paused, letting that sink in. When I woke in his house, I thought he would harm me like the others had. Instead, he gave me water, food. He asked nothing. Nali looked at his father, then back to Kalen. I did not trust him. I ran as soon as I could stand. I was wrong to run. The admission hung in the air. Among the Apache, Nahali's words carried weight. He was not just the chief's son. He was a respected warrior in his own right. His acknowledgement of debt gave legitimacy to his father's decision. But Delgado wasn't satisfied. He spoke again, this time directly to Nali. The younger man's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. The tension between them was palpable. Mongus raised his hand for silence. When he spoke, his voice carried absolute authority. Whatever he said, it was final. Delgado's face darkened, but he gave a sharp nod and turned away. The chief looked at Kalen. I have declared that you are under my protection. Any Apache who harms you answers to me personally. This is now known. He paused. But I cannot protect you from what your own people will do when they learn of this. That burden is yours. Before Kalen could respond, a young boy ran into the clearing from the canyon path. Breathing hard, he spoke urgently to one of the warriors near the edge of the gathering. The warrior's expression changed instantly. He stood and approached Mongus, speaking quickly in low tones. The chief's face went cold. He looked at Kalen, and something in his eyes made Kalen's stomach drop. Riders, Mongus said, coming from the south, settlers, a dozen or more. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to just above a whisper. They are heading toward your property, and they are armed. The clearing erupted into motion. Warriors stood and reached for weapons. Women gathered children. The fires suddenly seemed too bright, too exposed, and Kalen realized with sickening clarity what was happening. Someone had seen him riding east, someone had followed him, and now a group of armed settlers was heading to his home, probably planning to burn it to the ground for collaborating with the Apache. While he stood here 2 hours away, completely unable to stop them, Ken's first instinct was to run for his horse. 2 hours back, maybe he could reach the property before the settlers did real damage. Maybe he could talk them down, explain. Explain what? That he'd saved an Apache, that the great chief had come to his door, that he was standing in the middle of an Apache gathering right now. There was no explanation that would satisfy. Armed men looking for a reason to burn. I need to go, Kalen said, already. Turning toward his horse. Mangus caught his arm. The grip was firm but not rough. You will not reach them in time. And if you do, you will ride alone into a group of angry men with weapons. They will not listen, they will act first. It's my property, Kalen said. It is wood and dirt. Mongus replied, you are alive? There is a difference. Delgado stepped forward, speaking rapidly in Apache. Whatever he said made several warriors nod in agreement. Mongus listened, then shook his head. Delgado's voice rose. Insistent now. The chief responded with two sharp words that silenced him. Nolly moved closer to Kalen. Delgado says this proves settlers cannot be trusted. He wants to send warriors too. Drive your people away from your land by force. That would start a war, Kalen said. Yes, Nahal agreed quietly. That is what Delgado wants. He believes war is already here. He thinks my father's protection of you is weakness. He sees this as an opportunity to prove settlers will always be enemies, no matter what kindness is shown. Kalen looked at Mongus. The chief stood with his arms crossed, watching the exchange between Delgado and several other warriors. The division in the gathering had become a chasm. Half the people there looked ready to ride out immediately. The other half looked uncertain, waiting for their chief to decide. If your warriors attack those settlers, Kalen said to Mongus, it won't just be my problem anymore. Every settlement for 100 miles will arm up and come looking for revenge. Everything you're trying to prevent will happen anyway. I know, Mongus said. His face was granite. But if I do nothing, I appear weak to my own people, and a weak chief cannot protect anyone, not his tribe and not you. The weight of the situation pressed down on all of them. Kalen had saved one life and now stood at the center of a conflict that could end dozens more. He thought about his house, his barn, the fence post he just repaired, all of it probably already burning, years of work reduced to ash. Because he'd made one choice that seemed simple at the time. Let me go alone, Kalen said. I'll ride back if the damage is already done. There's nothing to fight over. If I can reach them before they act, maybe I can convince them to leave. They will ask where you were, Nahal said. I'll lie, they will not believe you. Then I'll tell them the truth and deal with the consequences. Kalen looked at Mongus. But if your warriors ride out, the consequences get bigger for everyone. Let me handle my own people. Mongus considered this. Behind him, Delgado spoke again, his tone urgent and aggressive. Other warriors voiced agreement. The chief raised his hand for silence. But this time the gesture took longer to have effect. Authority was slipping, and everyone felt it. Finally, Mongus spoke. You will not go alone. He gestured to Nahal. My son will ride with you, not to fight, to witness. If the settlers harm you, my people will know the truth of it. If you manage to calm them, my son will return and tell us peace was possible. His eyes hardened. And if they burn your home and drive you out, then Delgado will have his proof, and I will have mine. Nam moved to his horse without hesitation. He still moved stiffly, but determination overrode pain. Kalen wanted to argue. Taking Nahai would make things worse, not better. But he saw the logic. Mongus needed information, not just outcomes. And the chief was giving Kalen a chance to prove that peace between their peoples was still possible. It was a slim chance, but it was the only one he had. Kalen mounted his horse. Nahal did the same as they turned to leave. Delgado called out something in Apache. Kalen didn't need translation to hear the contempt in it. What did he say? Kalen asked as they rode into the canyon path. Nahal's voice was tight. He said, we are both fools who will die for nothing. He glanced at Kalen. I think you might be right. They rode hard through the darkness. The moon provided just enough light to navigate the canyon path and open ground beyond. Kalen's horse knew the route home and needed little guidance. Beside him, Nolly kept pace despite his injury, jaw clenched. Against obvious pain, neither man spoke for the first hour. The only sound were hoofbeats and their own breathing. Kalen's mind raced through scenarios. each one worse than the last, best case. The settlers would be gone by the time they arrived, having found nothing worth their trouble. Worst case, his home would be destroyed, and they'd still be there waiting as they crested the ridge that overlooked his property. Kalen pulled his horse to a stop below in a shallow valley. He could see his land clearly in the moonlight. The house still stood. The barn looked intact. No fires burned. Relief flooded through him. For exactly 3 seconds, then he saw the horses, at least 10 of them tied near his corral, and near the house, a group of men stood in a tight circle. Lanterns cast harsh shadows across their faces. "They're waiting for you," Nolly said quietly. "Looks like it. This is a trap." Probably. Nolly studied the scene below. "We could leave, find another path. You do not have to face them, and go where—" Kalen shook his head. "This is the only home I've got. Besides, running just confirms whatever they already believe. They will hurt you. Maybe I can talk sense into them." Kalen didn't believe his own words, but he urged his horse forward anyway. Nah. Followed. After a moment's hesitation, the men below noticed them approaching when they were still 100 yards out. The group shifted, spreading into a loose line. Kalen recognized most of them. Henrik from the trading post. The 2 Garrett brothers who ran cattle east of the settlement. Thomas Pike, who fancied himself a leader despite having no official authority. Others he knew by face, if not by name. Every single one of them carried a rifle or a pistol. Kalen rode into his own yard and dismounted. Na stayed on his horse, positioned slightly behind and to the side. Smart, less threatening that way, but close enough to react if things went bad. Thomas Pike stepped forward. He was a big man, thick through the shoulders, with a red face and small eyes that always looked angry. Right now they looked furious. "Well," Pike said, "look who decided to come home. And look who he brought with him." "This is my property, Thomas," Kalen said evenly. "What are you doing here?" "Funny thing," Pike replied. "We came by earlier to talk about some stolen horses. Thought maybe you'd seen something living out here by yourself." He gestured around the yard. "But you weren't home. So we waited and waited, started wondering where a man might go in the evening without telling anyone." Kalen said nothing. His silence seemed to infuriate Pike more. Then little Jimmy Collins. "You remember Jimmy Henrik's boy? He comes riding up all excited. Says he was hunting rabbits this afternoon and saw something interesting. Saw Kalen Thorne riding east toward the canyon, Apache territory." Pike took a step closer. "Now, why would you be heading that direction, Kalen? What business could you possibly have with the people who've been raiding our supplies and stealing our livestock?" "I haven't stolen anything," Kalen said. "Didn't say you did, but you're mighty friendly with them that have." Pike's eyes shifted to Nolly. "Friendly enough to bring one right to your doorstep, or should I say their doorstep, since it seems like you're working for them now." One of the Garrett brothers spat into the dirt. "Traitor," he muttered. The word hung in the air like poison. Once spoken, it couldn't be taken back. Kalen felt the shift in the group. They'd come here suspicious. Now they were certain. 3 days ago, Kalen said carefully, "I found an injured man near my creek. I brought him here and treated his wounds. He left. That's all." "That's all," Pike laughed, harsh and humorless. "You gave aid to an Apache, then their chief shows up at your place, then you ride into their territory like you're one of them, and now you come back with another savage right behind you." He shook his head. "You're either the dumbest man alive, or you're exactly what we think you are." Kalen glanced at Nahal. The young Apache sat perfectly still, hands visible, making no move toward any weapon, but his eyes tracked every man in the group, calculating distances and angles. "I saved a life," Kalen said. "If that makes me a traitor, then your definition's pretty narrow." Pike's hand moved to the pistol at his belt. Several other men followed suit. The yard was suddenly bristling with weapons, all pointed in Kalen's general direction. "Here's what's going to happen," Pike said. "You're going to pack what you can carry and leave tonight. We'll burn the rest so the Apache know what happens to collaborators and your friend there." He nodded toward Nolly. "He's going to deliver a message back to his people. Tell them if we see any more of them on our side of the territory line, we'll will do worse than burn an empty house. Kalen's hands curled into fists. This is my land. Not anymore, it isn't. Kalen looked at his house, the place he'd built with his own hands, the life he'd carved out of empty land through years of work, all of it about to become ash. Because he'd made one choice that seemed right at the time. He could fight, draw his weapon, and make Pike think twice. But that would get him and Nolly both shot. It would give Delgado exactly the excuse he needed to bring warriors down on every settlement in the territory. The violence would spread like wildfire, and more people would die. Or he could walk away, let them burn it, survive to start somewhere else. Neither option felt like winning. Pike raised his hand, signaling the others. Garrett, get the lanterns. Well, start with the barn, then wait. The voice came from behind Kalen. Na had dismounted and now stood beside him. He spoke clearly, loud enough for all the settlers to hear. Before you do this, you should know something. 3 days ago, I was dying, ambushed by enemies who left me to bleed out in the dirt. This man found me. He did not know who I was. He did not know my father's name or position. He knew only that I needed help. Pike's face twisted with contempt. We don't need a history lesson from you, need the truth. Nahal interrupted. His voice carried absolute conviction despite his pain. This man saved my life, knowing it might cost him everything. He expected nothing in return. When I woke in his home, I was afraid he would harm me. Instead, he offered water and food. I repaid his kindness by running away without a word. One of the younger settlers shifted uncomfortably. Henrik's son, the one who'd spotted Kalen riding east, the boy looked uncertain now, less sure of his accusation. Nolly continued. My father came here to honor a debt, not to make an alliance, not to plan raids, to say thank you for returning his son from death. He looked at Pike directly. If you burn this house, you do not punish collaboration, you punish compassion. And you prove that the war between our peoples can never end, because kindness itself becomes a crime. The words hung in the night air. Several men exchanged glances, the certainty that had unified. Then began a crack. Not all of them. Pike still looked ready to strike a match, but enough that the group no longer moved as one. Pretty speech, Pike said, doesn't change facts. He helped in Apache. He went to their territory. He chose a side. I chose to save a life. Kalen said quietly, if that's choosing a side, then maybe the sides are wrong. Pike's hand moved toward his pistol, but before he could draw it, hoof beat-at sounded from the ridge. Everyone turned. A line of riders appeared against the sky. Apache warriors, at least 20 of them, led by Chief Mongas himself. They stopped on a high ground, perfectly positioned to see everything happening below. Delgado sat among them, his face impossible to read from this distance. The settlers immediately raised their weapons, pointing them toward the ridge.